Okay, we are live. Yes, that's right. We are live for RotoViz Radio, the RotoViz live version of RotoViz Radio. Welcome, everybody. This is the New Hampshire race, July 16th, 2017. I am, of course, your host, Nick Giffen, on Twitter at RotoDoc. And we will be taking all of your NASCAR DFS questions throughout the show. Of course, use the hashtag RVLive to ask questions, and I'll answer them on air. Just a lot of stuff to talk about at New Hampshire today. We've got a competition caution coming out, so we'll want to talk about how that affects things. We had the situation with Kyle Larson moving to the back of the field because of his qualifying time being disallowed for a illegal rear deck fin lid alignment. And so he will start 39th for DraftKings scoring purposes. That means Martin Truex Jr. starts first for DraftKings scoring purposes, Jimmy Johnson second, Matt Kenseth third, and so forth. So everybody moves up a spot. Kyle Larson starts dead last, 39th, will be scored from starting position 39 for DraftKings scoring purposes. So we got that. We have the competition caution to talk about. And then we also just have general race strategy and all of your questions to answer. But I need to remind everybody, we've got this 30% listeners only discount. And, with 18 races left in the season, that's still half the season left. So we got 18 races. The 30% discount brings it down to $52.50 for those 18 races. That's less than $3 per week. So if you're subscribing every week, and you're subscribing weekly for $7 a week, sign up for the rest of the year with a 30% discount, $52.50 for 18 races. That's less than $3 per race. So just wanted to remind everybody about that. As usual, we've got a great show. I've got the Paul Menard hat going on here. I actually have, instead of my normal Budweiser, I have it's a mimosa, but it has a tequila limeade type concoction there with some jalapeno in it as well. And so it's mostly champagne, and then I put in this tequila limeade hot jalapeno concoction. It's really good. So no Budweiser today. Sorry to disappoint you guys there, but I had to go a different direction this week. All right, so we've got a great show, and let's first talk about the competition caution. So we are going to have a competition caution. I think that is going to be something that we do want to mention will affect the race. So, sorry, I'm Google searching something here. But it will affect the race. I think it could affect how much you want to play Martin Truex Jr., for example. So I do expect Martin Truex Jr. to jump out to a lead, right off the initial restart. He's got Jimmy Johnson on the outside there. But the question remains, what happens after the competition caution, and how does that affect things? So competition caution is at lap 35. So after 35 laps, I expect Truex probably to lead all 35 of those laps. We'll get a caution. At that point, teams can come in and can begin to change tires and refuel. So that'll be the earliest anybody can refuel, so no fueling allowed before then. And then pit stops will happen. And what could happen, of course, is maybe Martin Truex Jr. has a little bit of a slip up in the pits, or now there's a second chance for a restart. So that could, shake things up. Maybe somebody stays out on that competition caution because you don't need to come in and pit for tires necessarily at New Hampshire. I mean, tires definitely help. We saw that in the Xfinity race. 4 tires were better than 2, although 2 let you stay out front for a little bit, which helped Kyle Larson win that first segment. So it could shake things up. Maybe Truex comes in and pits, and maybe some people decide to stay out. So that is much more of a reason to fade Truex than we had earlier in the week before we knew of the competition caution coming. So I wonder if anybody will chance it, will stay out. Maybe some teams take 2 tires and Truex takes 4. A lot of different ways this could go. So I think we can reduce our ownership percentage of Truex a little bit because of that. So I had him at about 55 to 60%. I might play him now about 50 to 55%. Not a huge amount, but there is certainly some reduction we can make in that. As I mentioned, the reason I'm not going bananas on Truex this week, if we look at New Hampshire history, out of the last 24 races, only 17 times has the pole sitter scored more than 60 fantasy points, more than 55 fantasy points, I should say. And so only 17 times. So it's only 30%. So if we say the pole sitter is only 30% going to be in the winning lineup, Well, if let's say Truex is better than the average pole sitter, then that makes about 50 to 60% we would want exposure to him. So I still like that 50 to 60% range, but maybe it bumps down with this competition caution to 45 to 55% range or something like that. So that's kind of like the GTO. Now, obviously, you can go overweight on Truex if you want to think he's going to be fine and nothing's going to happen in the competition caution. If you want to go underweight on him, that's totally fine too. If you think things will happen with this competition caution and kind of shuffle him out, then I certainly understand being underweight on Truex. So that's what I think is going to happen this week with the competition caution and how it affects our strategy. Now, who might benefit from it? Kyle Larson, I think, definitely benefits from it because they get to run 35 laps, they get all bunched up, and then he gets to pass a bunch more cars on the restart. So Kyle Larson will be in great shape. He's a great play this week. I know he said he didn't like his car in final practice. It was junk, but everybody's car is junk when it's the hottest part of the day, the hardest part of the day to get grip. He was still fast, still very fast in final practice, and I think he's going to have a top 8 car this week. So if you come from 39th and you finish even, let's say, 9th, that's still 30 places of place differential. Then, you got to add in 35 places of finishing position. So if he finishes like even 9th, then he's guaranteed 65 points. Let's say 10th, then he's guaranteed 63 points just based on the combination of finishing position and place differential. He'll pick up some fastest laps. That's good enough to be in the winning lineup. So I love Kyle Larson this week. Let's get into your questions. The first question we have here, it says, #RVLive. On the pod, you mentioned the importance of 10-lap average. Blaney had the second fastest 10-lap average in final practice. The model also seems to like him, but he starts 15th. Is he a cash game play or no? I do not have him as a cash game play, and that's not because I don't like him. I just think that he's starting a little too far forward. There's some other roster constructions that I think make a little bit more sense in cash games than using Blaney. I think I will be running 3 cash game lineups this week, and I haven't decided if I'll use Blaney in any of them, but right now he's not in my one that I've created. But if he is, he would only be in a maximum of one of mine, of my 3. But in my main cash lineup, he's not going to be in it at all. Next question, #RVLive. Now with Larson and Truex cash game locks, is it more important to get another high dominator, or is it okay to, if you do that, dip down to somebody like David Reagan level type driver for the last slot in cash games? I think that's a viable, cash game roster construction. I think that's one a lot of people will take. They might go something like Truex, Truex, Larson, and Kyle Busch, for example, or Truex, Larson, and Kevin Harvick, or Truex, Larson, and Brad Keselowski. There might be different constructions there of cash game with a third expensive driver, and in that case, sometimes it does mean you have to drop down in price to the David Reagan level. If you do, for example, Kyle Busch at 10,500, you're definitely going to need to drop down under that 6K range. So it just depends on how you want to approach cash games, but that's certainly a viable roster construction for cash games. It's not the one I'm taking in my main cash game lineup, however. Next question. Rank your RCR drivers both in GPP and cash games, including the affiliates of the 13, 47, and 37. So that is Ty Dillon, AJ Allmendinger, and Chris Buescher. So then the other 3 drivers, Paul Menard, Ryan Newman, and Austin Dillon. So in order, I think my favorite I'll talk GPPs here. My favorite for GPPs is probably Paul Menard. So that's going to be number 1. Ryan Newman will probably be number 2. Austin Dillon, number 3. Then number 4, I think I like AJ Allmendinger a hair over Chris Buescher, 5. And then Ty Dillon, 6. So that's for GPP. For cash games, I think it's probably pretty similar. I maybe like Newman and Menard neck and neck for 1. I did write up Menard. I also think Newman's a fine play in cash games. And then let's see, Austin Dillon, not too enthused about him in cash right now with the practice time. So I might go just being a little price sensitive. I might actually go with one of the other affiliates. I need to look up their prices real quick. I don't have them on the top of my head. But let me scroll down here. So yeah, then I would probably go with AJ Allmendinger, then Chris Buescher, then maybe Ty Dillon, and then Austin Dillon. But I don't love any of those last 4. I really only for cash games like Newman and Menard. My internet's being a little slow right here. 1 second. There we go. Next question, hashtag RV Live. Did Austin Dillon's practice times of 26th, 26th, and 29th put you off of him for cash game consideration? Yes, they did. And not just his single lap times of 26th and 29th in the 2 post-qualifying practice sessions, but his 10-lap average in final practice was also not stellar. It was only 23rd. So I don't see him making up a ton of positions. So I'd rather go with somebody who had maybe a little bit better single lap speeds and be a little more price sensitive. So, you know, somebody like Danica Patrick, as we mentioned, she had a better single lap speed and she had a better 10 lap speed in final practice, and she's 6,200 versus Austin Dillon being 7,000. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a one or the other between those two, but makes a lot more sense to use Danica Patrick than it does Austin Dillon. Next question, hashtag RV Live. In lineups that you aren't using Truex, who are you using as your dominators? Well, I have a lot of them. I'm definitely spread out in my non-Truex lineups. There's everybody from, you know, Kyle Busch, Brad Keselowski, Kevin Harvick, Jimmy Johnson, Chase Elliott, Ryan Blaney, I think could potentially dominate, although he's starting pretty far back, so I don't necessarily count him as a dominator, but I think he has a chance to dominate at some point, lead at some point in this race. I wouldn't necessarily say dominate, but some of those main culprits. Denny Hamlin, of course, I also wrote him up. And then maybe a smidge of Matt Kenseth, but I think he's probably going to be a little too high owned for my liking here. Next question, hashtag RV Live. How do you feel about AJ Allmendinger in the last spot in a GPP lineup? I don't hate it. I think, obviously, you know, we want to nail the dominators. And if you nail the dominators, then definitely I think I like taking contrarian plays as, you know, further back in the field than I do further up in the field this week. So, I don't mind playing AJ Allmendinger for a last spot in a GPP lineup. I just wouldn't go bananas on him if you're multi-entering. Next question, hashtag RV Live. It seems like the 2-car will be under-owned given his history. Where does he need to finish to make value? So I'm not so sure if he's going to be under-owned. That's kind of the first part of this. My model puts him at 13.2%. I actually think he'll probably be closer to 20%. Just because of his track history. You know, obviously my model has a plus-minus percent of about 5 to 8%, somewhere in there. So I think he could be around 20%. He might be one of the ones the model misses the most. But if he's in that 20% range, I kind of like him right about, you know, 15% ownership. If he's going to be 20%, I like being underweight on him. If he's going to be at 13%, I like being a little overweight on him. I think about 15% makes sense. And I have less than 15% of them in the Beast, but I have more than 15% of them in some of the higher GPPs. So I think all told, my adjusted for a buy-in level, I think I'm probably around 15% on Brad Keselowski. Next question, hashtag RV Live. Would it be too contrarian to fade all the big 8s? So that would be the 48, 18, 78, and 88, and load up with mid-tier drivers starting in the mid-teens and 20s. It's a move you can make in the Beast. I wouldn't make it in something like the Victory Lane, which is a little bit smaller, or any 3 max or 20 max type. Maybe the 20 max, but the Beast, I definitely think that's probably, if you're going to make a move like that, it would have to be in the Beast, fading Jimmy Johnson, fading Kyle Busch, fading Truex, and fading Dale Jr. You'd obviously still want Larson. You'd want to find another dominator or two. Maybe that's Denny Hamlin. Maybe it's Brad Keselowski or Harvick or whoever we talked about. But since you're eliminating Johnson and Kyle Busch and Truex, that's definitely extremely contrarian. I might go chalkier with my plays that are in the back at that point if you're going contrarian with your dominators. So I might play somebody like a Danica Patrick or a Paul Menard, who I think will be pretty chalky of the 6K range of drivers, and then hope to hit on some contrarian dominators or some mid-range plays, like we talked about, Ryan Blaney or Chase Elliott or another driver maybe that we haven't talked about much yet, Clint Boyer, for example. So those are some names that I think I think you're probably pivoting to if you're doing this kind of a construction. Next question, hashtag RV Live. In GPPs, can we fade the 78, 42, and 18, or do we need at least one in each lineup? So this is a question about Larson, Kyle Busch, and Truex. I think you probably want to have, close to 85, 90% Larson at minimum. He's coming from the back. I talked about it. The problem rate at New Hampshire, the significant problem rate, meaning you go far enough laps down that you're not in contention, even if you still finish the race. But the significant problem rate is only about 15%. And so for a driver like Kyle Larson, it's probably less than 15%. Maybe let's say it's 10% that he has a significant problem. And then maybe you say, 3%, 5% of the time he doesn't have a significant problem. He maybe has a minor problem that puts him not far enough forward, like on the last restart or something. So, like, I think 85% ownership is like the GTO number for Kyle Larson. So you're talking about probably around 15% of lineups you should be playing without Kyle Larson tops. Maybe if you want to get a little extra leverage, you can go 20, 25%, something like that. But I really do think 85% is like the GTO number for Larson this week. So that said, if you're at 25% of lineups without Larson, you probably want to have at least Truex, maybe Kyle Busch in there in one of those. Otherwise, you pretty much have, I would think, no chance at winning a GPP if you faded all three of them in a lineup. I guess it's possible. It's certainly not probable, though. There was a race last year where, Harvick was on the pole and Truex started 40th, and both of them were like 60% owned, and they both crashed out early. And so, whoever didn't have all of them won a GPP, but it was very, unlikely scenario. And I guess it could happen, sure, but now you're adding in a third car with Kyle Busch as well. That's not to say that Kyle Busch is necessarily the third best play here. Maybe he is. I mean, certainly by the model, he's a top 3 play. Certainly by speeds, he is. But he hasn't, shown the finishing of a race that we want to see out of him. So he hasn't won a race yet. Same with Chase Elliott, for example. So it's tough to say, but I probably would have at least one of the three in all of my lineups. I certainly will this week. Next question, #RVLive. Is a lineup with Kyle Busch and Larson enough for Dominator potential? Yeah, I think it'll be enough. If this is one of your non-Truex lineups, then you have Kyle Busch. Larson could even potentially dominate. New Hampshire is wild. If you go to the NASCAR Sims app, so rotoviz.com/NASCAR-Sims, and we look up Kyle Larson, I think this is really interesting. His closest comps for this race at New Hampshire with his driver statistics and his practice times and his qualifying position, one of his closest comps is Denny Hamlin from 2012. Denny Hamlin started 32nd. He had the best practice time, the best 10-lap average time, and best final practice time, best 10-lap average in final practice. Now, Larson didn't quite have that, but Larson also got held for a penalty. He probably would have been right up there in 10-lap, and he was 4th in single lap and slower in 10-lap, but that's because he went later in the session, was hotter. So he probably, his times are comparable to Denny Hamlin. His starting position, comparable to Denny Hamlin. His statistics as a driver, comparable to 2012 Denny Hamlin, who was a lot better then than he is now. And Denny Hamlin started 32nd, won the race, led 64% of the laps despite starting 32nd, and had 32% fastest laps. And that's the third closest comp out of the 20 closest comps to Kyle Larson. So certainly it's possible he dominates. There are some other comps in here. Kyle Busch, 2010, started 22nd, led 15% of the laps, and practiced third in single lap and 10-lap. And then 2010, Jeff Burton started 17th, not quite as far back, led 29% of laps, practiced second and 6th in single and 10-lap. And so, definitely some comps there that I think, show that Kyle Larson, not out of the realm of possibility, he could lead a portion of this race. But I wouldn't necessarily consider him a dominator. So you got Truex and Larson. I think what you're going to end up doing is you're probably going to end up using somebody like, Ryan Blaney or Clint Boyer or Chase Elliott or Kevin Harvick. And those all have dominator potential. They're also pretty low. But I think, what that ends up doing is, yes, you've got enough dominator potential with Truex and Larson and some of these auxiliary pieces. If things shake out a little weirdly, which they can towards the end of a race at New Hampshire, it's not the most predictable race. So, and then you add in the competition caution, you add in the segments. Yeah, maybe there's some possibility here because segments this week are 75 laps. And so the first two segments, 75 laps each. Well, the competition caution comes at lap 35. So that's interesting because if you take the remaining 40 laps, and then 75 laps in the next segment, that's 115 laps, and you've got a lot of caution laps under there. So, that is pretty close to making on a fuel window at New Hampshire. So it's tough to say. I think, maybe all the cars come in and pit, and they try to just stay out through the whole second segment. That's kind of tough. It might be possible, not really sure, but definitely could be some interesting strategies this week. So I think we could potentially see a little bit of shakeup of dominators, adding this competition caution in. So circling all the way back to your question, I think that's enough dominator potential with Kyle Busch and Kyle Larson, because I think you'll pick enough other pieces that have some probability of dominating as well. Next question, hashtag RV Live. Blaney versus Menard versus Austin Dillon in cash games. I strike off Dillon. Probably would rather go with Menard than Blaney, but that's going to change the way you construct your lineup. Obviously, they are very different in price. Blaney 8,300, Menard 6,500. So it very much changes your cash game roster construction. But I like Menard in cash games. I like Blaney in GPPs. Next question. Talk me off of my LaJoie love this week. I'm not high on Corey LaJoie. I'm not high on too much roster construction dipping way down there. Obviously, people are latching on to LaJoie's single lap speed there in practice 3, where he posted the 25th best time. I think a lot of people will see that, and I think Corey LaJoie will go over-owned because of that. So, I think Corey LaJoie probably be a person that a lot of people love. I saw some talk about him on Twitter. I think he'll go over-owned, and there, that back of the field is just so random. I mean, LaJoie's had so many problems this year anyway. He could have a problem this race. Maybe a guy like David Reagan does well, or Cole Witt, or survives at least some of the carnage. But this isn't a race with a high amount of carnage, so I expect this is a race where there's a lot of cautions and stuff at the end, but there isn't a lot of DNF rate. So I think at the end, what we'll see is probably it's going to be less likely than a lot of other races that one of these back markers ends up in the winning lineup, especially given that I think it's not all that guaranteed that we'll have like 3 really expensive finishing guys. Obviously, we'll have Larson, probably Truex, but it's not like guaranteed that Kyle Busch is going to lead. It's not guaranteed, somebody's going to lead. If, for example, Ryan Blaney leads a chunk of this race, or Chase Elliott leads a chunk of this race, I really think the winning roster construction will not dip down into the 6K range, so lower than 6K range. Next question, hashtag RV Live. I have a small player pool. Is this week likely to be as chalky as last? So I think yes and no. Kentucky has better predictability in that, like, my model can predict it almost about 0.6 R-squared. It was just under. It was like 0.58. Whereas with New Hampshire, it's right around 0.5. So less predictability here. So I think you want, if anything, a little more spread out of a player pool than last week. Last week was very chalky in terms of the actual result, and it was one of the more chalky tracks in general that we get to see on the course of the schedule. New Hampshire is on the back half of the chalky level, so in terms of what we see, and that's because very often we get a lot of late cautions, so it's slightly behind the mid-pack of all the NASCAR tracks on the circuit in terms of predictability at New Hampshire. So I like spreading my player pool out a little bit this week, which is why I'm not going like crazy high ownership on a ton of people other than obviously Larson, and then I talked about my Truex ownership percentage. Next question, hashtag RV Live. Does the competition caution? Okay, so we talked about that at the top of the show. Next question, practice times seem to have nice correlation here. With that said, what's your exposure to Chase Elliott? Could be a potential pivot from the high ownership percentage. I definitely like Chase Elliott this week. I don't want to say my exact exposure to him, but suffice to say, I think I'll probably be overweight to the field. But I think a lot of people could see that he's a good practice. Has good practice here. He raced here really well last year before I think not ending up finishing. I need to look that up, but he definitely was one of the faster drivers here last year as well. So, Chase Elliott, a driver I like this week a lot. Next question, hashtag RV Live. What do you think of Ryan Newman in cash? I think he's fine in cash. I definitely have him in my main cash lineup right now. My question is if I play 3 cash lineups, for example, will I have him in all 3? I think probably not. I don't love him this week, but I like him this week, if that makes any sense. So, I'm looking real quick. I want to look at Chase Elliott, what he did at New Hampshire last year. He finished 34th in this race last year, but he had in the fall race last year, I think it was the fastest practice time in final practice, and he raced really well. He had a decent driver rating. Just didn't put the finish together here at New Hampshire. All right, next question. I have Bilicki and Jeffrey Earnhardt showing up in my GPP lineups. Should I hate myself? Yes, I would not do that. Don't play Bilicki and Earnhardt this week in GPPs. Next question, hashtag RV Live. Harvick in cash, question mark. Yeah, I think he can be a cash game piece. Maybe I wouldn't play him in a ton of cash game. Like I said, if I go 3 cash game lineups, I might have him in 1. Whereas I think with somebody like Newman, I would consider between 1 and 2. So I think Harvick a little lower in the cash game totem pole for me, just overall relative to price and salary and stuff. But I think he's feasible in cash games. Now we look at his practice times. They don't look great on paper, but Harvick's never been one that puts up sometimes he does. He puts up very fast single lap speeds. But at New Hampshire, he just wants to get comfortable. He's willing to sacrifice, trying to find top speed for long run speed and comfortability. He's very good at the flat tracks. And so I think he'll be okay. I'm trying to flip over here and take a look at his 10-lap speed. So Harvick's 10-lap speed was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th best. I do think he was held back in practice. Was he one of the cars that was held back in practice, final practice? So if that's the case, his, the fact that he's 10th in 10-lap average, just like Larson was 9th in 10-lap average, is a little bit better because they did it later in the session. So not worried about Harvick. I actually think he's a decent play this week in all formats. I just wouldn't go bananas on him because he hasn't shown race winning speed, for example, like Kyle Busch has and Kyle Larson and Martin Truex Jr., the big three, have. Next question, hashtag RV Live. Anybody 6K and under going to be in the winning lineup? We talked about this. I think it's possible. I just don't think it's as likely as other weeks. I think this week with Larson not loving his car, he might not come as far forward with the competition caution. Truex might not dominate as much, especially with the way things happen at New Hampshire around the pole sitter. So I think we could see a little more spread out among the upper tier drivers, which means maybe we don't need to dip all the way down to that 6K and under range. That said, certainly it's possible. I do like LaJoie. If I do want to play one, I think he's probably going to be too high owned though. David Reagan's fine. You can take shots with whoever, Cole Witt. I mean, you're just taking shots at that point back there when you're dipping down in that range, hoping one of your guys survives and advances. So it's definitely tough to say, but drivers I think like Matt DiBenedetto and Michael McDowell are out given how they practiced versus where they qualified. They qualified both of them way too high, so I'd probably eliminate those two from your under 6K range. Next question, hashtag RV Live. Any update on second Dominator prediction after final practice? Yeah, we talked about that. It's most likely going to be Kyle Busch as the second Dominator to Truex, in my opinion. That said, don't rule out Jimmy Johnson. He's been very fast. He's starting second. He's shown very good practice times, so I think Jimmy Johnson is right there. Denny Hamlin showed speed in final practice. He's right there. A lot of guys could, sneak out front at different points this race, so I'm not so sure this is a week that 60% Truex is optimal. Like I said, maybe 50% Truex is better this week. Next question, hashtag RV Live. With Toyotas in 6 out of 10 in final practice, top 10 in final practice, is this a good tiebreaker for drivers in the same price range? Yeah, I think that's actually a decent tiebreaker. Might be stack the Toyotas. Maybe they found something. Next question, hashtag RV Live. When looking at final practice, more concerned with only finishing rank or finishing rank against starting position? I'm concerned with finishing rank against starting position most, but then also finishing rank for drivers, who are starting farther forward. I just want to see what is their practice speed. If Jimmy Johnson's, starting whatever, like in the top 10, as long as he's practicing in that top 5, I think he's a solid play because that means he has a chance to win the race, for example, type things. So it depends on where a driver starts. The further back you start, the more I look at practice times relative to, so practice rank versus starting rank. So if you practice 20th but qualified 30th, that's a difference of 10. I count that a lot more than if you practice 12th and, or I should say qualify 12th and practice 8th or something like that. I definitely give more weight to difference further back we are in terms of like cash game potential. Next question, is 15 to 20% of lineups with Kyle Busch, Truex, and Eric Jones a negative correlation? It might be a bit of a negative correlation. Eric Jones definitely has a good car. I'm playing Eric, so I mentioned him in my article as a high risk play, and he's very high risk. So I don't want you to go bananas on your Eric Jones exposure. I certainly don't want people to go crazy on the Eric Jones exposure, but I think if you're going 15 to 20% of Eric Jones exposure, all with Kyle Busch and Truex, you probably have some other Eric Jones lineups without Kyle Busch and Truex, I would say. So you're probably going too much Eric Jones here. Remember, when I say high risk, that means he's less likely to finish in the winning lineup, but I also think relative to his ownership percentage, he's a good play. So I want to go like 15, 20% on Eric Jones total. That means with With Kyle Busch and Truex, I'd want to have less than that because I only want to have about 50% Truex and Kyle Busch probably even less than that. So, I think that is too much together and too much negative correlation. They're going to take laps led away from each other, especially with Erik Jones starting as far forward as he is now in 7th position. So, I think there is some negative correlation. I do understand, wanting to stack the teammates or the Toyota guys there, but I think it's a little bit too much negative correlation and too much just exposure to Erik Jones in general. Next question, hashtag RV Live. I'm having trouble with the 14 to 25th place starting drivers. What are your thoughts? There's a lot of plays there, as I mentioned. We've talked about Dale Jr., Clint Boyer, Ryan Newman. Who else? I'm flipping over here to the starting position grid. We've got Blaney. Suarez has practiced well. Logano, this is a good track for him, even though he didn't practice very well. Not super high on him. DiBenedetto, we're not playing. Stenhouse, I don't mind in GPPs at all. We're avoiding McDowell. I actually kind of like Eric Almirola. I think he's going to go under-owned this week, and he's shown a little bit of speed, especially in final practice relative to second practice. He was a little quicker there. And then if we look at his 10-lap average in final practice, where is it? I need to scroll down. Sorry about that. Eric Almirola, flipping over, 27th in 10 laps. So not as good in final practice for Eric Almirola in 10 lap, better in single lap. But that might be okay given that, with his single lap speed, and we get a lot of late restarts, maybe that helps here at New Hampshire more than the 10 lap. But so I kind of like Eric Almirola. If we keep going down the list, let's see, who's after Almirola? Chris Buescher. Could play a little bit of him, and then Allmendinger could play a little bit of him, and Ryan Newman like him as well. So that's kind of what I think of that range. Next question, stars and scrubs day or balanced lineups? I think it's going to be more of a balanced. I don't think it's necessarily going to be stars and scrubs, but I think it could be like stars and 6K range, like 6 to 7K range, like Trevor Bayne, Eric Almirola, Danica Patrick, Paul Menard. Those drivers in that range right there, I think, are good plays this week to combine with your higher priced drivers, and then throw in maybe a mid-priced driver like an Erik Jones, a Dale Earnhardt Jr., a Clint Boyer, something like that. A Chase Elliott, a Brian Blaney, for example. I like these kinds of roster constructions this week. That's kind of been my go-to. But I certainly think there are other roster constructions as well. You can go more stars and scrubs, like dip down under that 6K range. That's possible. That's not my preferred construction this week. And then there's the extra balance, which is like a lot of 7 and 8K drivers, maybe with a stud or two. Next question. Do you like Harvick in cash games? We talked about him. I don't mind him. I definitely have him in, if I were to play 3, I'd definitely have him in 1, I think, based off of the way my model's shaping up right now. And then what about Chase Elliott in cash? I'm not playing Chase Elliott in cash. I think, obviously, with his practice times, he's certainly possible. I just like the safety a little bit more with Harvick, where he's starting just a couple spots further back in 12th, I should say. And then Chase Elliott is starting 11th. So that's kind of what I think right there. And also, I bungled all of those starting positions on 14 through 25 or whatever. They're all off by 1 because, of course, I forgot to move Kyle Larson to the back when I was just mentioning those. I still mentally have all of them from there when I did the podcast yesterday, but you get the idea. Anyway, hashtag RV Live. Do you like going overweight on Danica in GPP? I actually think she's going to be, 35% owned, something like that. I think my model has. So I like being about equal weight on Danica and GPP. I think she's a very good play this week. And she's been a lot of winning GPP lineups lately, which is kind of cool to say because everybody always gives her crap for crashing. But this year, a lot of the crashes haven't been her fault. And if she had avoided some of those, she could actually be putting together a pretty decent year. So, yeah, I like Danica Patrick in GPPs. I think I'd probably go pretty close to equal weight. I don't mind being a little overweight. I also understand being a little underweight because this is the more variable part of the lineup is these drivers in the 6K range. So I think that ownership percentage of 35 is about right where I'd want Danica overall. So then it's just a question of your strategy. It does bring in a little more safety to go overweight on Danica, so I think understand that perspective. Next question, hashtag RV Live, thoughts on Jimmy Johnson, cash games and GPP. Not playing him in cash, but I think in GPP he's an interesting play. I'll have less of him in the Beast, even though I probably should have more of him, I think, but more of him in the higher stakes stuff, I believe, is my personal exposure to my personal exposure to Jimmy, just because I wanted to go a little bit different way in the beast with some other contrarian plays. Next question, hashtag RV Live. How much more do you weigh final practice this week because the sun was out compared to cooler temps in the first two? Final practice this week is definitely the key. It's better than using second practice, especially even the end of practice two will probably be the most relevant. If you watched practice, you saw Jeff Burton and Steve Letarte talk about how the fact that this is going to be the most important part of all of the practices was that latter half of practice, the final practice. So definitely way more the final practice than the first practice. So I am using that as a little bit of a trend. Which cars got better, which cars got worse as you go from practice 2 to practice 3. So drivers like Denny Hamlin picked up. They went from 9th to 3rd. You've got your drivers like Ryan Blaney picked up from 19th to 8th, but also had a very good 10-lap average in final practice. And then your drivers went the other way, like Trevor Bayne, who went 14 to 20, but he still had a decent 10-lap time. I think it was 22nd or 23rd. He starts 28th, so tough to say there with him, but I think you can have some exposure to him. Ryan Newman, for example, if we look at him, 23rd, 22nd, pretty consistent across the range there. So I just think Ryan Newman's going to go higher owned than I would like in GPPs, so I'll probably be a little underweight on GPPs, but I'll definitely have him in cash games as we talked about. Next question, hashtag RV Live, is Suarez a decent GPP play? I think he's a fine GPP play. Obviously he's one of those drivers that picked up in final practice 15th to 7th. There are some extenuating circumstances. There were a lot of drivers that had to wait to go out in final practice. Clint Boyer, Kyle Larson, Eric Jones was one of them. Multiple drivers. It was like 5 or 6 drivers. So it could artificially inflate some of these drivers' practice times. Like Daniel Suarez, for example, might be inflated just a little bit. So that said, Daniel Suarez, what did he do in 10-lap? He was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 best in 10-lap average. So he's got a decent car, and his starting position is in a spot that will allow you to take advantage of playing him, right? So he starts 14th, and so he could move up into the top 10 by race end and maybe end up in the winning lineup. So not a bad GPP play at all. Next question. Haven't heard too much on Logano. High on him for GPPs? Nope, not high on him now. I was high on him before we got to those post-qualifying practice sessions, just because I thought he'd be low-owned, and this is a good track for him and things like that, but we're not seeing it from Logano right now. He's been struggling lately in general. Just priced too high for what he's probably going to do this week. Favorite driver under 6K, I guess it's Corey LaJoie, but I think everybody's favorite driver under 6K is Corey LaJoie, so I guess in GPPs I might go to somebody like, let me flip over here, maybe somebody like Cole Witt, I think would be an interesting GPP play under 6K if you really wanted to go that way. Next question is Jimmy Johnson and Truex in the same lineup viable for GPP? I think it's viable. I just don't think it's super high probability. I think, obviously, if Truex is starting second and Jimmy first, I think it'd be more viable. But Truex is starting first, and we got the competition caution. I guess that it could make it a little more viable than normal if Jimmy could leapfrog Truex in the pits. So, yeah, viable, but then you're also probably pairing him with Larson. So you just have to think about that when you're constructing your lineups. Next question, thoughts on Corey LaJoie and his fast speeds in final practice. Talked about him a lot already. Like I said, I think he's going to go too high owned because everybody's talking about Corey LaJoie and his fast final practice speed. Next question, Blaney or Dale Jr. for GPP? I like Blaney better than Dale Jr., but I like them both. Hashtag RV Live, why is no one touting Trevor Bayne? I am. I like him. I definitely have exposure to Trevor Bayne, probably just as much as I have in GPPs as Paul Menard and Danica Patrick. I think those three are the three that I like just mixing and matching in the 6K range. And then to a lesser extent, drivers like Allmendinger, Almirola, and in that 6K range there. So I like Trevor Bayne in that 6K range. Here's me touting him as about equal percentage to Paul Menard and Danica Patrick in terms of my exposure in GPPs. And, what does the model say? The model says that Danica Patrick will be about 35% owned, Paul Menard 33% owned. It says Trevor Bayne will only be 11% owned. So I think you're getting some nice overweight exposure on Trevor Bayne if you're going in that 30% range as well. And that's, like I said, my preferred roster construction this week. So that's why I'm higher on Bayne than most people. Next question, hashtag RV Live, is Eric Jones for Dominator in finishing or Bayne for finishing in GPP, I'm not quite sure I understand the questions. I think I like Eric. I mean, I don't know if this is a question choosing between Eric Jones and Trevor Bayne, but I'd probably, yeah, I don't understand the question. I think Eric Jones is a low owned play. I'd actually rather have more exposure to Bayne than Jones, even though I wrote up Jones as a GPP play, just because I don't think anybody will talk. I do these things because I don't think anybody's going to talk about Jones this week. But in practice, when I was listening on the radio and then watching on TV, everybody talked about how Eric Jones had a really fast car. Obviously, it didn't show up in final practice speeds because he went out later in the session because he had that 15-minute hold penalty in final practice. But I really like Eric Jones, and I just think relative to what he's going to be owned, I think he has a better chance of being in the winning lineup. Now, of course, me saying that will bump up his ownership percentage just by saying that. So I think 15 to 20% is probably where I want Eric Jones. I want more exposure to Trevor Bayne than I want Eric Jones. So that kind of explains my thought process there around writing up Jones, not writing up Bayne. I don't always take the most common position, but that's why I put these, clarifiers like Eric Jones is a very high risk play, but I will try to be overweight on him. Of course, when I say I'll try to be overweight on him, then I also bump up his ownership percentage as well, because people like Stevie TPFL, people like myself, we do move the market a little bit in terms of ownership percentage. That shows up statistically significant in my model. Next question, can you give us 2 drivers who will be overweight on the field in GPPs? I just talked about 2 of them. Trevor Bayne, definitely one of them. And then I think another one that I will be overweight on, let me go flip here to my ownership percentage projections that I have who I'll be overweight on. Definitely, I think, just flying through here. I think I'll be overweight on Chase Elliott as well. I really liked his practice speeds. My model has him about 16%. I think he'll probably go closer to 20, 25%, but he's actually been down lower than I've expected the past couple weeks, so 16% might be right. People seem to not like Chase Elliott for whatever reason in recent weeks, so I'll probably also be overweight on Chase Elliott, depending, of course, on where the field ends up. Hashtag RotoViz thoughts on Logano. Just talked about him. Don't love him this week, unfortunately. Just not fast. Doesn't have a fast car. Logano. This is a very good track for him, and I could see maybe a lot of restarts at the end. If we get one of those type deals, he could push his way up into the top 10. But I don't even know if that ends up in the winning lineup if he only finishes 10th or 8th or something like that. Hashtag RotoViz. I have one cash lineup: Kyle Busch, David Reagan, or Harvick Menard. I like Harvick Menard more than I like Kyle Busch, David Reagan. A little more safety with Harvick and a little more upside with Menard, and equal safety to basically David Reagan back there. So, it's not guaranteed Kyle Busch will lead laps here. And so if it's not guaranteed he's going to lead laps, or at least raise your floor by leading laps, I'd rather raise my floor by going with Menard, who has a much higher floor than David Reagan outside of a problem. That said, the Kyle Busch, David Reagan construction will certainly be popular this week, and I can understand taking that approach as well. Hashtag RotoViz, is your Menard hat a sign or prediction of being on the winning lineup? No, it's not. I'm just on a Paul Menard kick lately these few weeks. Next question, RV Live, Allmendinger or Almirola in GPP? I prefer Almirola. I think people will be off of him because of his back injury. Maybe some people will be on him just because they haven't gotten to use him in a while, but I'm on Almirola more than Allmendinger. I think people will like Allmendinger a little bit more because of his flat track history, but he and Almirola basically have shown equal speed, so it's really just an ownership percentage play. I like Almirola a little bit more than Allmendinger relative to their ownership percentages. Next question, is Truex a better fade in 3 max or 150 max tournaments? I think probably in 3 max he's a better fade because people will tend to go a little more chalky in the 3 max, and I think that said, the 100, the beast, talking about a huge prize pool. If something does happen to Truex, you have a much better shot at winning a huge prize pool. But I think just in terms of relative to how much you're buying in for and things like that, probably a better fade in 3 max than in 150 max. Next question, RV Live, rank these 3 in safest order for GPP floor: Harvick, Johnson, and Chase. So GPP floor, we want ceiling. I don't really know why we're looking for floor here, but in terms of floor, I guess I would rank it Harvick, then Chase, then Johnson. Johnson, there's no guarantee he's going to dominate or anything like that. So in terms of GPP upside, I think Johnson's most likely to lead laps, obviously starting second. And then I think Chase, probably I would give the nod slightly over Harvick just because of practice time. So different in floor versus ceiling, and in GPP I'm looking for ceiling. Next question, Jamie McMurray, GPP. I'm not using him. That said, I think he's, a driver that can pull off another top 10 finish here. I just don't think that, he really has a top 10 car. He practiced 12th and 18th. Starting too far forward there in 4th place. Not really on my radar this week. I think we're at the end of the questions here. One more question, hashtag RV Live. Thoughts on Daniel Suarez and GPPs. Had a great final practice, 10-lap speed, and he also, of course, had a decent single-lap speed. So we're talking Daniel Suarez. He qualified 14th, practiced 7th best, and then in the 10-lap average, Daniel Suarez was 6th. So good car, good track for him, good car, and a fine GPP play. I just wouldn't go bananas on him because he is still a rookie. He is starting pretty far forward in 14th. But certainly possible to be in the winning lineup there with a good car and a cheap price. So, versus somebody like Trevor Bayne, I think, you could definitely make a case for less exposure to Trevor Bayne and more exposure to Daniel Suarez. And I think that's a fine move as well. All right, that's going to do it. We got about an hour and 15 minutes before lineups lock. So good luck, everyone. I hope you all have a great week, and we will talk at you next week.